Certain animals might spring to mind when it comes to folklore. Hares, horses, deer, cats, they all have an otherworldly quality to them. Would you consider the same of cows? And there's actually a surprising amount of folklore about cows. They can be death omens, fairy cattle, consumption cures, or even the guardians of treasure. And that's not even considering the deities associated with cows or their appearance in mythology. Just look at the various versions of the Taurus origin myth. But these are just a few of the things that we're going to have a look at in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. We're following up the sheep folklore episode last week with one on cow folklore, and thank you to everybody who contributed in some way with what a sheep melt might be in a sheep skirt. So that was quite an interesting conversation to have. And yeah, I just love the fact that these are the kind of things that we talk about because they're important issues, but it also helps us to unravel some of the folklore a little bit for contemporary audiences, let's be honest. So like I said in the introduction, we are going to have a look at cow folklore. And we have actually looked at the Tarvuska before, which is the water bull from Scottish folklore. So I'm not going to cover it again here, although you can find a tale about the Tarvuska in the Islay folklore episode. And if you're on YouTube, there is a link to that. And if you just search it on the podcast feed, you will find the one for the folklore of Islay. As I say, it's in there. There is also a lot of folklore about cattle in Irish myth and legend, but the Irish Pagan School actually have a class on that if you want to know more about that specifically. So I will put the link to that in the show notes. Now, this episode is going to predominantly focus on English folklore, but we are going to do something slightly different this time because a lot of these are significant story types, if that makes sense. So what I want to know is, have you heard similar legends where you are? And if so, what are they and how similar are they? So I would love to hear from people for this one because I want to see how these stories have travelled and also where they've travelled to as well. So there's a bit of audience participation with this one. So it'll be interesting to see if you know a similar version of any of these stories. So speaking of the stories, it's probably best just to get started. And we're going to start with one of my favourite things in the world, which is death omens. I mean, you know I'm a cheerful person. You heard the morning folklore episode. But we're going to start off with cows as death omens. And we're going to Chartley Castle in Staffordshire to investigate a rather interesting herd of cattle. Now, they were described as being small and white, with black tips on their horns and black muzzles. Some of them thought they actually descended from prehistoric wild cattle, much like the Chillingham cattle in Northumberland, which we will come back to in a moment. Now, interestingly, according to some sources, the inside and part of the outside of their ears were red, which does really make them sound a bit more like fairy cattle. But in the 19th century, a legend began that the birth of black calves among this particular herd heralded death for one of the Ferrers family who lived at the castle. Now, the legend claims that this tradition dated to the 13th century because apparently such a calf was born and a few months later a member of the Ferrers family was killed in the Battle of Burton Bridge. In his book from 1907, Haunted Houses, Tales of the Supernatural, Charles G. Harper refers to an article published in 1842 in the Staffordshire Chronicle, which apparently linked 7 different black calves with 7 different deaths in the family. And that took place across 1827 to 1835. Now, naturally, I looked for that article, but British Newspaper Archive only have the Staffordshire Chronicle going from 1887, so they don't have the 1842 ones, so I couldn't actually look up the articles in question. We only have Harper's word for it, unfortunately. But for such an apparent ancient tradition, no one actually mentioned it before the 19th century. And Harper notes the fact that there was no mention of a black calf born around 1760 when Earl Ferrers was hanged for murder. So that would be quite an interesting use of a death omen at that point. No mention of it in the papers. It only seems to get mentioned, as I say, in this article from 1842. Now, belief in the omen did really seem to fade throughout the 19th century, and it is possibly due to the better genetic mixing of the cattle, or just possibly the fact that because the Ferrers family, I think, ended up moving away, you don't have the same intrinsic link. Now, surprisingly, it's not the only story involving cows as death omens, because in 1850 someone reported that 3 cows got into their garden, and they then went on to have 3 deaths in the next 6 months. It seems that people believed that death followed if a cow got into your garden. I'm assuming the death didn't come at the hands of the cow, but it does seem that a cow in the garden meant there'd be a death in the family, which is an interesting superstition, and I'd be quite interested to see where that one came from. But speaking of the Chillingham cattle, they're a wild herd that lives in the grounds of Chillingham Castle up here in Northumberland, and according to legend, they are the descendants of the cattle that roamed across Britain when the Saxons arrived. Now, there's another suggestion that the Vikings brought them when they arrived, and that's due to genetic similarities between the cattle and a Swedish breed. They've never been managed by humans, so they're actually incredibly inbred, and with less than 150 animals, they're actually rarer than pandas and mountain gorillas. Famed northern engraver Thomas Bewick actually created a print of one of the cattle called the Wild Bull in 1789, and there is actually a metal plaque that shows his engraving, which was made in 2003 and installed by the Bewick Society in the ground on what is now Bewick Street in Newcastle upon Tyne to mark Bewick's 250th birthday, because he lived near the spot where you'll find the plaque from 1781 until 1812. And to be honest, the print was one of his most popular. I think it was possibly his most famous as well. So I do quite like the fact that this really famous print of his does also immortalise this particularly rare cattle. Now we're going to go from one extreme to the other, to the Roaring Bull of Bagbury, which is quite a bit of a mouthful, but I do think the Roaring Bull would make quite a good pub name. And obviously there is an episode on pub names if you're interested. And I am considering doing another one, so do let me know if you'd like to hear about some more pub name origins. But this particular legend comes from Shropshire, and it was collected by Charlotte Byrne in the 1880s, and she's famous for collecting a lot of Shropshire folklore. The legend begins with an odious squire, because aren't they always in folklore, and he worked his men hard and treated them ill. He had only ever done 2 good deeds in his entire life, giving a poor man a waistcoat and a poor boy some bread and cheese. Now after he died, he reappeared as a massive bull with a fearsome temper. The spectral bull haunted the farm, roaring so hard that the tiles and shutters broke free from the building. Sometimes he also appeared as a dark man, and a servant watched this figure walk through the back door and then out of the front, with the doors flying open despite being locked. No matter how often the servant locked the doors, the figure blew the locks open again as he passed through the house, and folklorist Jennifer Westwood suggested demonic aspect to the figure at this point. I got really excited when I saw mention of a dark man, because I thought back to the interview with Dara about the dark man in folklore, but I don't actually think this is the same concept at all. But obviously at this point in the story they decided that there was nothing else for it, they needed to lay the ghost. So a group of parsons, either 9 or 12, it depends on the version that you hear, gathered in Hissington Church. They carried lit candles ready to pray the ghost away. And this is quite a common thing that you get with ghost laying. The parsons have to gather, they have to light candles and then just basically keep praying until the ghost is conjured into something. Often a boot, sometimes a bottle, sometimes a box. It depends on the story. Now, the bull actually rushed into the church, blowing out all but one of the candles, obviously in an effort to try and prevent this ghost laying from working. Luckily, an old parson had guessed that the bull was going to pull a trick like that, so he'd actually somehow kept the candle inside his boot so it remained lit, and the others could then use it to relight their candles. As they prayed, the bull grew smaller and smaller and smaller still. Eventually, their prayers made him small enough to fit inside a snuff box. The bull at this point asked to be buried under the bridge so that he could cause every mare to lose her foal and any woman to lose her child. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the parsons declined the request and threw the box into the Red Sea, and as far as anyone knows, it remains there still. Ghost laying is such a fascinating concept, and again, I'm happy to do an episode on that at some point if anyone is interested. Now, while the previous story sees an evil, wicked man take the form of a bull to persecute his community after death, a tale from Warwickshire sees cow body parts used for counter-witchcraft. And this isn't a potropaic, this is literally returning negative witchcraft back where it came from. So in the 1880s in Willington, a farmer noticed illness spreading through his cow herd. Sensing this was witchcraft rather than normal disease, he removed the heart from one of them. He stuck it all over with pins and roasted it. A weird animal like nothing he'd ever seen before appeared at the kitchen door trying to reach the heart, scratching at the door in his effort to get through, but the farmer had had the forethought to bar the door. After some time, the weird animal just lay down and died at the door, and soon after the cows recovered. Now, such practices do appear elsewhere in English folk magic, and it is a kind of reversal of bad fortune, if that makes sense. And we can't know in this case if the weird animal was actually the witch who cursed the cows or her familiar, but either way, destroying the heart destroyed the curse. And while obviously we looked at a spectral bull that made a bit of a nuisance of itself earlier, there was also an interesting story of a spectral calf related to treasure hunting. So I thought I wanted to include that one just because it adds to the weird variety of stories about cows. And this one comes from the old county of Westmoreland and involves Hackthorpe Hall, which by the early 19th century had become a farmhouse. Now it seems a spectral calf appeared to the tenant farmer one day and then led the farmer to a stone cattle trough in the grounds. Beneath it, he discovered a cache of hidden gold, and there was actually enough for the farmer to buy 2 estates. Now, it's unclear why a calf would be the guardian of such gold. Perhaps the guardian merely took the form of a calf because it was a familiar animal to the farmer, maybe it was related to the fact that the treasure was under a cattle trough, or maybe it just decided to choose as unthreatening an animal as possible. Because I don't know if you've ever really seen calves, but they're really unbearably cute. So if you are going to follow a spectral animal, the one that's probably least likely to do you harm is probably a spectral calf. So I quite like that one. So if you've heard of any ghost cows, by all means do let me know, because I kind of feel like there'll probably be quite a lot of stories of ghost cows. But it would be quite interesting to see what people have. And I wanted to move on to, for probably quite a large portion of this episode's running time, to something which turned out to be a really common story motif. And again, I'm interested to see if this appears elsewhere. And that's the idea of the dun cow. And various stories around Britain, so it's not just England for this one, but in general, they explore the idea of a supernatural cow whose milk never runs out every day. So during a famine, the locals could still access milk, so the cow would basically save their lives. Now, in these stories, at some point or other, one person turns up with a sieve rather than a bucket and milks this cow into the sieve, and because the sieve can never be filled, the milk runs out. What happens next varies depending on the story. So in some versions, the cow goes on a murderous rampage in the area, and one such version of this is the Dun Cow of Warwick, which was said to stand some 3.6 metres high with flaming red eyes. And that story attributed the slaying of such a dangerous beast to the famous adventurer Sir Guy of Warwick, who actually killed her on Dunsmore Heath. In 1552, Dr. Caius described seeing bones from an enormous animal in Warwick, said to be those of the Dun Cow, and one rib alone was 1.8 metres long. Another Dun Cow appears in Lancashire, roaming the moors of Bowland, Browsholme, Parlick and Bleasdale. People from the area could milk this cow, and she'd happily fill any pail to the brim as long as you only took 1 pail. So it was 1 pail per customer, and all was well. Eventually, a witch from Pendle brought a sieve, and the cow produced milk all day, yet could not fill the sieve. The cow disappeared, leaving the community without her seemingly inexhaustible supply of milk. An old house on the outskirts of Longridge nearby displayed a large bone over the main entrance and claimed it was one of this Dun Cow's ribs. Now, folklorist John Harland and T.T. Wilkinson said it was actually part of a whale's jaw. And this is the other thing that you start to see, that where people have these massive bones that they claim are part of a Dun Cow, they're actually more likely from a whale. So I don't know how much the stories have grown up to explain the presence of a whale bone, or if people have just misidentified it or what. Now, the version told in South Lopham in Norfolk actually adds another layer, because a rock known as the Oxford Stone was said to hold the impression of a cow's hoof, because according to their version of the legend, the Dun Cow kicked the stone when her milk ran dry before she disappeared. And in the version of the legend from Stanion in Northamptonshire, which also features a giant bone in the church said to be from the cow, she sadly died of a broken heart after being unable to fill the sieve. And I think that one upsets me more than the others, just at the idea that the cow's trying to do something really lovely for people, and then she dies of a broken heart because some idiot comes along and completely ruins it. But among these various tales of magical cows, I wanted to highlight one from Shropshire, because this one dovetails with stone circles, and we all know how much I love a good stone circle story here on Fabulous Folklore. And a circle on Condon Hill near Cherbury has been called Mitchell's Fold since around 1840. It likely dates to the early Bronze Age, and the circle attracted various stories among local people, the way these things do. In one legend, a giant actually used the circle as a pen for milking his cows. Antiquarian William Stukely thought Druids used the circle as a temple, although, to be fair, Stukely could probably squeeze Druids into almost anything. But the most popular version of the legend saw the fairy sending a cow to the area to help the locals during famines. She always appeared at Mitchell's Fold every morning and night, and as long as people only took one pail of milk, she never ran dry, no matter how many people milked her. Eventually, the old witch Mitchell came along, filled with spite and resentment, and she milked the cow into a sieve that the cow clearly couldn't fill. The cow disappeared and no one ever saw her again, and some people actually thought she went on to become the wild dun cow killed by Sir Guy of Warwick. Now, the witch was turned to stone as a punishment, and the other stones are there to keep her in place, so this pen is actually not a fold belonging to Mitchell, but rather a fold enclosing Mitchell. So I thought that one was quite interesting, how we have this particular story type which is attached to lots of places around the country. So loads of places have this story. I've just picked out a handful of them. And indeed, some of them actually see the fairies leave the cows to help people in times of famine. And it's the fairies who take them back because of the fact that obviously people have been really ungrateful about it. And like, I don't know about you, but I certainly wouldn't want to show any ingratitude to fairies. That just seems like a really stupid thing to do. But in this particular instance, that's then tied to a stone circle. So I thought that was a really interesting combination of two different story types. And if you are interested in tales of fairy cattle specifically, but this time in Wales, they do appear in the legend of the fairy bride of Llyn which I did talk about in the Banau Brycheiniog episode. So there's that if you're interested in that. But we are going to close up the episode with folk remedies because, my God, my favourite part of the sheep folklore episode was quite clearly the sheer number of folk remedies involving sheep. And it did strike me as quite interesting how a lot of them were to do with respiratory ailments. And it seems that cows also have something similar but with specific respiratory complaints. So in 1851, those with pulmonary issues were recommended to sleep in a room above the place where cows were kept, obviously if that was possible. And in Pembrokeshire, one butcher recommended that if you had tuberculosis, you should stick your head into a freshly slaughtered carcass and inhale. He even recommended that you should actually pull the skin tight around your neck in order to get a better seal, and that just sounds absolutely horrible. And even as late as the 1980s, people believed that anyone who lived within the smell of a cow yard wouldn't get tuberculosis. And I found it really interesting that there was this link between cows and TB, which there sort of is anyway. But it's just interesting that the cows would then be linked as the cure to TB rather than potentially the cause of it. But we should also thank cows for their role in the development of the smallpox vaccine. And this is not folklore, this is medical history. And I've never really mentioned it, I don't think, so much on the podcast, but you've probably guessed I'm interested in it anyway with the sheer number of folk remedies and whatnot that I include. But I've always had a fascination with the history of medicine. And I have favourite anatomists and things like that because, of course, I do. And we did it at school and I just found it the most interesting thing ever. So I don't really talk about that much on the podcast because it's folklore, but I thought in this particular instance, it was really useful to include it because I think quite a lot of people aren't quite sure what happened in this instance. So in the 18th century, Edward Jenner noticed that milkmaids often caught cowpox from the cows, but they didn't catch smallpox once they'd done so. So cowpox, from what I can gather, was actually quite a mild illness that was just a bit unpleasant rather than particularly dangerous, but the milkmaids then seemed immune to smallpox. So Jenner then wondered, could cowpox be used to ward off smallpox in some way? So in 1796 he decided to test the theory. And he used material from a cowpox sore to inoculate an 8-year-old boy. Obviously, there's lots of ethical issues with that, but this is the 18th century. And the boy did get mild cowpox and made a perfectly complete recovery, as you would do with how mild cowpox was at the time. Jenner then exposed him to smallpox and, yes, you guessed it, the boy proved immune to it. So Jenner then went on to test the theory repeatedly, as is the scientific method, and he laid the foundation for the smallpox vaccine. And it's particularly notable because the World Health Assembly actually declared the world free of smallpox in May 1980, precisely thanks to a vaccination programme. So I thought it was really interesting that from the humble dairy cow, we then end up with this vaccine which actually eradicated a really, really unpleasant illness. So I thought that was quite cool. So that's not folklore, that's actually medical history, but I thought it was necessary to mention for various reasons, but also relevant to the topic at hand. Normally at this point in the episode, I would say, what do we make of cows? And do like a loose conclusion. But in this case, I'm going to skip that and give you your homework assignment if you are interested or indeed can take part. And it is this idea of, are there legends or tales of cows, cattle, bulls, anything like that in your area? or an area that you know well. So perhaps where you grew up, maybe where you are now, maybe you've heard it from somebody else who works around them or something. Have you heard any of these story types just in different locations, or have you heard different variations of them? Because I'm just curious to see, as I said at the beginning, how these stories have travelled, where they've travelled to, and how they've maybe adapted once they've reached different places. So are they different in North America? Are they different in Australasia, perhaps? How have they changed as they've moved around the world? So I just thought that would be really cool to have a look at, because it's something that I noticed particularly with the sheep one, how many people hadn't actually necessarily heard the remedies one, but they'd maybe heard other stuff instead. So that would be a really cool thing to have a look at. And it's something that I'm actually quite keen to do a bit more of this year, actually collecting your folklore as well. So what you've heard, the stories you've heard, the tales you know, and actually kind of collecting them in some way, to provide like an ongoing body of knowledge about folklore as you're encountering it, rather than just me looking at books, but how are you actually coming across it during the course of your day. So that is what I hope will work out quite well. So if you want to know how you can take part in that, there's about 3 different ways mostly, but you can leave comments on Spotify, but I can't always read them. It depends which web browser I'm using, which is deeply irritating, but never mind. You can always leave comments on the YouTube video, which is probably the easiest way, because then it's really easy for me to reply. Like, YouTube is really well set up for that kind of thing. You can message me on social media. I am on all the platforms, but I'll be honest, my account on X is basically just camping to preserve my username. I don't really use it. Blue Sky is the best one to get me on, but Instagram, you can always message me on there. I'm always open to messages. Or you can leave a comment on the blog post, and that is in the show notes, where it says find the images and the references on the blog post, and there's a link. You can also leave a comment on there as well. That's a self-hosted website, I should point out, so you should be able to leave a comment without having to have a WordPress account, hopefully. I think that's the way I've got it set up. Or you can always email me as well, and my email address is on my website. So lots of different ways that you can send us stuff. If you do comment publicly, then it means that obviously other people can reply to you as well, and then we can get a bit of a conversation going, which is always quite fun as well. But as I say, I just thought it'd be really interesting to see how and where these stories have ended up. We're going to have a look at pigs next week, I think. And I'm thinking of the Christmas pig stuff that the lawmen do, but I will obviously do pigs in folklore, and I may or may not decide to include the Amityville horror stuff that I did do with the lawmen, just because obviously that is absolutely my area, and obviously I did actually do Amityville in my PhD. But we shall see. I might find plenty of weird pig stories anyway. So again, if there's anything specific that you know that you think I should know in advance, please do let me know. And I think we're probably going to finish up with goats, which, I mean, let's be honest, we're going to find all kinds of weird stuff about goats, I would imagine. But anyway, it's been lovely chatting to you, as always. I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.